"We are commencing legal action against Mrs. Meghan Markle. Her televised allegations, particularly the Oprah interview, have inflicted undue harm upon the royal family. An apology no longer suffices. The matter will now proceed through the end," and with those explosive words, the controversy was no longer private, negotiable, or safely buried beneath polished palace smiles. According to this dramatic account, one signature from King Charles, backed by William's determination, placed every royal residence beyond Meghan's reach. Windsor, Balmoral, Sandringham, the message was brutal, but that signature was merely the final act. The real scandal was the chain of suspicion, rejection, and wounded loyalty that allegedly forced the palace to go this far. Charles stared at the final page longer than expected, confronting a formal decree carrying the monarch's authority over royal property. Meghan would no longer be permitted to enter or remain at any royal residence unless the king personally changed the order. This was not simply about losing a bedroom or missing an invitation. It was about belonging, trust, access to the monarchy's most guarded world. William stood opposite his father, motionless and unsmiling. He had reportedly pushed hardest for a permanent boundary, yet there was no victory flashing across his face because he knew Harry would feel the punishment almost as deeply as Meghan. Harry was still his brother, and any door slammed against Meghan could inevitably separate him from the family as well. Charles understood that horrifying contradiction. His hand hovered over the document, caught between the cold authority of a sovereign and the aching instincts of a father. Then the pen touched the paper. The king signed, placed it beside the decree, and remained silent. William did not celebrate. He simply watched the decision become final. But one detail made everything even more explosive. Harry had not been barred under the same sweeping terms. Meghan had been deliberately named separately, creating a distinction so sharp that nobody could mistake the message. For Meghan, those royal doors had not become merely difficult to open. They had officially closed. Why had William decided ordinary limits were no longer enough? Behind the formal palace language stood three completely different wounds. William believed the monarchy required protection. Harry saw another wall being built between himself and the family he once knew. Meghan saw something far more devastating, a declaration that she was no longer simply distant from royal life, but excluded from its physical heart. Charles, trapped between all three, understood that every available choice would permanently wound somebody. Harry reportedly learned about the decree privately before its wider consequences became clear. At first, the wording sounded so absolute and personal that he assumed there must be a misunderstanding. Then the crushing detail was repeated. Meghan had been named in a way he had not. This was no general tightening of security. His wife had been placed outside residences representing family gatherings, private memories, and the royal existence they had once entered together. Meghan listened without interrupting while Harry explained the restriction. Windsor was not merely stone, gates, and ceremony. It represented a chapter when she had lived inside the royal world and attended private family occasions, believing those spaces might remain connected to Harry and their children even after their departure from official duties. William recognized the emotional weight, but from the opposite direction. As heir, he increasingly viewed royal residences as protected environments involving confidential staff, security, private conversations, and the future stability of the institution. Personal disputes had already escaped into interviews and public accounts. Now, the fear allegedly concerned what might happen inside the residences themselves. Harry lowered his phone and searched for a gentler way to deliver the worst part. None existed. Meghan remained controlled until he explained that even future private family visits might depend upon whether she was allowed through the door. That was when her expression reportedly changed. The decree could separate husband and wife during moments supposedly reserved for family. Charles had resisted such severity before, preferring controlled access and individual approval. Something had changed. William's final intervention mattered, but the real origin of the decree lay months earlier behind another royal door, during a tense Windsor gathering where one conversation transformed suspicion into policy. There were no cameras and no public confrontation that day, only discussions about future visits, staff privacy, private apartments, and boundaries. Charles hoped the meeting might repair the damage. William arrived with far less patience, arguing that any future visit involving Meghan required advance approval and written conditions defining where she could go, who could accompany her, and what must remain private. He considered it protection. She considered it a rule book designed around her name. Meghan objected immediately, questioning why she was treated as a unique danger while Harry remained part of the same dispute. When William insisted the rules concerned access rather than identity, Harry intervened. Procedure became loyalty. Suspicion became fury. Meghan rejected the conditions, Harry refused to support restrictions separating them, and William stopped trying to persuade either of them. Charles wanted time, fearing formal exclusion would destroy any remaining possibility of reconciliation. William no longer believed time could repair broken trust. He pushed his chair back, stared silently at Harry, rejected the handshake his father had hoped would calm the room, and walked away, leaving behind a warning that the next confrontation would be even more brutal. When William and Harry finally confronted each other without advisors, softened messages, or carefully rehearsed palace language standing between them, years of resentment exploded into one brutal argument about trust, privacy, and whether Meghan was being deliberately pushed beyond the royal gates. William insisted this was protection, not punishment, arguing that private family conversations had repeatedly escaped into interviews, recorded accounts, and public controversy, while Harry accused his brother of transforming personal resentment into palace policy because his wife had refused to remain silent. Then came the revelation that changed everything. William had already asked Charles to abandon verbal promises and formally approve the restriction. Harry stared in disbelief, suddenly realizing this was no threat spoken during an emotional quarrel. His father was considering it. When Harry demanded to know whether his brother truly intended to prevent Meghan from entering Windsor, William calmly answered that boundaries now had consequences. No shouting, no apology, just a sentence colder than any slammed door. But William could only demand the decree. The power to impose it belonged to Charles. Alone with the document, the king faced a horrifying choice. Signing meant accepting that the monarchy needed a permanent boundary, while refusing meant overruling the heir and allowing the same poisonous dispute to return whenever another visit was proposed. William warned that uncertainty had become dangerous because every negotiation could create another crisis. Charles still searched desperately for compromise, even considering invitation-only access personally approved in advance, but advisors feared that arrangement would confuse staff and security. One final clause survived: the monarch could suspend or alter the restriction during exceptional circumstances. It was a tiny opening buried inside an otherwise devastating order, giving Charles control over the only door that had not been completely sealed. Then silence swallowed the room. The glasses came off, one hand rested over the signature space, and the pen moved. Harry received the formal communication privately and read it twice, slowly absorbing the references to overnight stays, private entry, and residences controlled by the royal household. Meghan listened as Windsor, Balmoral, and Sandringham were named aloud, each place carrying memories of ceremonies, family meetings, and the royal existence she had once been expected to embrace. Disbelief turned into a frightening calm. Then she noticed the detail Harry had hoped she might miss. He had not been barred under identical terms. Future family occasions could now force him to choose between entering alone or remaining outside beside his wife. Meghan folded the pages carefully and placed them down without shouting. That silence felt more explosive than fury because the palace had issued a consequence without publishing the private accusations supposedly used to justify it. Harry went directly to Charles and asked whether the king genuinely wanted his wife excluded from places their family still called home. Charles admitted the decision would cause enormous pain, but refused to pretend the old trust remained. The restriction governed royal property, he explained. It did not erase marriage or blood. Harry demanded an immediate reversal. Charles refused. Then he corrected the assumption driving his son's rage. William had argued for the order, but only Charles had possessed the authority to sign it. Asked whether he regretted doing so, the king admitted it brought no satisfaction, yet insisted it had become necessary. Something inside Harry appeared to collapse. Another furious confrontation would change nothing. By morning, the private decree had become a public spectacle. One fictional front page placed Meghan beside the gates of Windsor, beneath the crushing message that the royal doors had closed. Crowds gathered, commentators argued, and the distinction between her exclusion and Harry's access became the scandal nobody could ignore. William was portrayed as the force behind the decision, Charles refused to offer a personal public explanation, and palace silence only intensified suspicion. In the end, nobody truly won. William secured the boundary he believed the monarchy required. Meghan accepted that royal residences were no longer hers to enter. Harry confronted a separation no appeal could immediately repair. Charles closed the file and moved to the next document without celebration. The monarchy had protected its private spaces, but sacrificed another piece of family intimacy, and behind those guarded gates, the consequences were only beginning.